What's up, guys? I'm Sean Finney. Welcome back to This Week at fedupchurch.org. We're going to be digging a little bit more into what this book actually has to say. Go ahead and flip over to Proverbs, chapter 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, I'm reading from the King James today because this is going to be most likely the version you're familiar with. If you spend any time in church, or if you're a parent, I guarantee you've had somebody quote this verse to you. And if you've heard it preached from the pulpit, I'd be willing to bet it's probably been taught wrong. But it's not the fault of the preacher, it's the fault of the translators. Let's dig into it more this week on Fed Up Church. So I have many issues with this verse, but I wanted to dig in more into it specifically because we assume several things. Anytime we read a Bible verse, anytime we read a different translation or dig more into the scriptures, we're going to take some things under consideration and some things under assumption. One of the things that we're taking under assumption with this verse specifically, train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. We assume that it means we are to teach our young children the way they should go, as in the Christian way. Follow God's way. That's the way that we're to train you up in. And we also assume that it promises that doing so will guarantee that our children will go on to live as good, successful Christians. We also assume it's about young children. So I want to dig into some of those assumptions and dig more into what the actual text says. But since this is one of the most popular verses among churchgoers, I will be using majority verses today. Will come from the KJV, and from there we'll kind of expound upon it. Before we dig more into it, I think we need to understand a little bit more about where the KJV translators in 1607 came from. So what were they doing and how did they do it? So in understanding how to translate different languages, you have to first consider how familiar are they with that language. And in this case, the language of the Old Testament is Hebrew. And a lot of them had been translated into Koine Greek at the time, so a lot of the English translators were translating it from Koine Greek. And they weren't very familiar with Koine Greek. They called it Hebraic Greek, Jewish Greek, that other Greek, but they weren't really familiar with it. They only had a couple of hundred documents to go off of when they translated these verses to kind of learn the language from. This would be equivalent to you trying to learn all of English only using the works of William Shakespeare as your reference. Compare that to modern translators after we literally have discovered tens of thousands of papyrus documents in Koine Greek that we were able to learn a lot more about the language, how it works, and how to use it, and what the intentions were. Because you have either one way, which is word for word translation, right? I say, azul in Spanish, I know that's blue in English, or, roja is red. Okay. But that's word for word literal translation. But what about the things where it's like the word was run? Right? You would immediately picture somebody running on a track. But what if I meant to use it in kind of the colloquial sense? I'm going to run something by the president and see if he approves the budget. It's different. So, and a lot of times when you're translating something from one language to another, there's no exact correlation. There's no exact word that translates. It's a word or a group of words, a phrase that we use to convey an idea. So I always kind of smirk a little, laugh on the inside when somebody tells me that such and such version is the most accurate Bible translation, or is the most close, the closest to the original. Because there's no such thing as a perfect Bible translation. It doesn't exist because they were in languages that we don't use. So we're getting as close as we can. Now understand, in doing that, the KJV translators in 1607, when they began this project, under the commission of King James of England, they did so to the best of their abilities. I'm not faulting the King James translators. They did the best they could with what they had, and that's great. Like I said, William Shakespeare is your reference versus the entire Library of Congress if you're today's modern translators based on the resources you have to learn language. So they kind of had to guess. They had to fill in the blanks. And in certain spots, there are certain words that they didn't really know what they meant, and they could find no reference for them anywhere else. And they alluded to that. So these are things that we would know if the King James version of the Bible came with the original letter in the front, which was from the translators to the reader, where they explain this. I'll give you an example. I have one. It's very long. It's pages upon pages. It's basically like an entire chapter that they wrote, where they openly admit this kind of lack of understanding to a lot of the Koine Greek words at the time, and they claimed that all the other English translations before them, because King James wasn't the first one. A lot of people think it was the first, language, the first time we translated the ancient languages of the Bible and the Scripture into English. It wasn't. Henry VIII had one as well, and there were many more. But they claimed that all those other ones are also valid. They're all the inspired Word of God. That wasn't the concern. That wasn't the question. But they said here there be many words in the Scriptures which be never found there but once, having neither brother nor neighbor, as the Hebrews speak, so that we cannot be holpen or helped by conference of places. In other words, it doesn't really help us to translate this word because it doesn't exist anywhere else, and we have no idea. So they kind of filled in the blanks to try to keep with the theme and with the idea of what it seemed like it was saying. So no matter what anyone tells you, there's no such thing as a perfect translation of one language to another. Now, a lot of your KJV advocates are probably already really mad at me, right? So the King James Version Bible is the only acceptable translation. I've heard that in many churches. It's the only inspired Word of God. The other translations change things. Yes, because they're more accurate. We know that now. But the King James translators kind of just threw things in there too at times. Now, it is a very good translation. I'm not saying that it's a poor translation. I've used the King James translation for many years. I've taught from it. I've preached from it. I don't have a concern there. But I think we need to dig deeper than the English translation of words. And understanding what the actual text in Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, what it actually read matters. So, I mean, if it was perfect and didn't need to be revised at all whatsoever, then why is the King James on its 13th revision in 400 years? Right? If it was perfect, there's no need to change it. But 1611 also had the Apocrypha in it, which a lot of Protestants disagreed with, so they removed the Apocrypha. The books of the Bible that typically Roman Catholic churches, you'll hear the Apocrypha, they'll teach from those books. Protestant churches don't. King James did, so you can't argue that King James is the only acceptable version, and then you cut out like how many books. Anyway, beside the point. So I encourage you just not simply taking any tyrannical government-sponsored book as fact on face value. That's my point. Because England was a tyrannical government. And it was a politically sponsored, government-sponsored, commissioned project, right? So view it in that lens in order to understand it, and then if something seems off, dig deeper. Reading through this verse, it seemed off, so I wanted to dig deeper. Let's break this verse down and see what it's actually saying. So the Hebrew, the beginning of this verse, the first half of the verse is what I want to focus most on today. And it actually, and I'll see if I can put it up here on the screen, Hanak Lanar al Pidarko. And I probably butchered the pronunciation of that, because I don't speak Hebrew either. But train up a child in the way he should go. Now, Hanak means to train, start, initialize, begin. Train's an adequate way of translating that word. Lanar, or Near, the word that it comes from, means young, single, marriageable bachelor of a man, right? Teenager, so to speak, adolescent. Al and P mean according to, because of, and Darko means way, journey, moral character, course of life. Now, the phrase in English that we have written today as in the way he should go, should is not in there. It's not in the Hebrew text. It's not supported at all. There's no reason for it to ever be in there. The translators made that up and inserted that to try to make what they were reading make sense. Now, there are several things that should immediately stand out when we start to look at the original text and the meaning of these words as we now understand them, right? There's some things that should immediately pop out to you. If you look at the English translation, which is train up a child in the way he should go, right? Versus train young man according to his way. Now, young man seems a lot different than child. I wouldn't call a 5-year-old, I would call that a child. I wouldn't call that a young man. Unless I'm just trying to boost his ego and his self-esteem. Now, call him a little man, young man, sure. But in the biblical sense of the word, where you see young man, I mean, David was a young man, right, when he fought Goliath. This has nothing to do with children. And we use it in churches. We hear it all the time. Like I said, if you're a parent, I guarantee you've heard someone say, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. But it has nothing to do with raising children. 1 Kings 11:28 in the King James says, "And the man Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor. And Solomon, seeing the young man, it's the same word. We translate it here as the young man, that he was industrious. He made him ruler over all the charge of the house of Joseph." You're not doing that with a child. We're talking about a young man, somebody who is eligible to be married off, somebody who is single, somebody who's grown, 18, 19, 20-something. A mighty man of valor here is referred to as a Nayar, right? Young man. So first things first, this is not about how to raise your children. There are plenty of other verses that guide us through that. This is not one of them. Now, I want to go to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. If you want a verse on how to raise your children, go to Ephesians 6:4. "And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." It's talking about raising children to fathers. It says bring them up. The word that we see here, bring them up, it's different than the word train. So that must imply there's something different about the verse in Proverbs we're studying. This word that we translate as train is only ever used 5 times in the Bible. 5. The other 4 times, it refers to somebody dedicating something to God. This is the only other time we translate it as train. And Hebrew scholars also admit, yes, this can be used, it was a common sense of the word, to train, like a sergeant would train their soldiers. But with such little information to go off of, this is the King James translation we end up with, is train up a child in the way they should go. So, if it means to start something, to initiate something, to begin something, right? Which is what training is, if you think about it. A soldier is going to get trained by their sergeant or drill sergeant, to initiate them into the ranks. If you get hired on at a job, what's the first thing you have to go through? Training. How do you start? Training. How do you begin? Training. So it has everything to do with training. Now, what do we know that it's saying so far? Put all that together so far, we end up with train young men, right? Or train a young man. So now that we've set the baseline, who's it talking about? It's not talking about young children. It's talking about young men. What are we supposed to do? Train them. How? How do we train them? Let's dig into that a little bit more today. So we need to remember this entire phrase, "in the way he should go," because apparently that's how we should train them. In the way he should go. What's that even mean? If you're a Christian, I'm sure you think, well, that's going to be training my young boys, or as they get into adolescence, to how to be a good Christian. I need to train them to do what I do. Train them in my traditions and my beliefs and my rules, and train them to do what I do. But that's not what it's saying, because if you remember, they took it one word, literally one word, and that word was Darko, which means way. And they translated it as in the way he should go. It's not at all what it's saying. The actual verse here says to train a young man in his way. In his way. Whose way? Obviously, if you've been in church for any length of time, you've heard sermon after sermon after sermon about this verse. It very, very clearly tells us we need to raise our kids to follow our traditions, our beliefs. And if we're right, if we do our job, they'll never depart from it. They'll never stray from that path that we've beat into them. This is wrong, right? Okay, it's dangerously wrong. Allow me to explain. I think this verse gets most misinterpreted by people, mainly because of the pronouns that it uses and the added words that the translators had to put in there to make it make sense to them. We hear his and immediately think it means his way. We hear the word in and we think it means in our beliefs, in our traditions, in what we know about God. Instead of what this verse actually means, which is going to make some people uncomfortable. It means according to, because of, in his way. The pronouns are what mess people up, right? Because if you're going to say in his way, okay, you're thinking God, because, God the Father. Let me rephrase this in English if it was to apply, for example, to say daughters. It doesn't, but let me just rephrase it to give you an idea of what it's saying here. Train a young woman according to her way. Now do you see it? Now do you get it? Do you see the difference there? What's that even? Okay, now that changes everything. That's a pretty exciting discovery when I came across it. As I was digging more into this verse, it's not about raising children at all. It's about what happens after you've raised them. Now that they're young adults, you're not raising them anymore. You're training them. I don't want you to miss the most important point here, because whether you thought this verse applied to kids or teenagers doesn't really matter much, right? At the end of the day, that's not really the point. What matters most is that we catch that key section, that key clause that says, according to his way. Train up a child in the way he should go, the way he should go. How should he go? What's his way? His way. According to his way. It's so very important. This is what I want everyone to understand. This is what I want you to get when it comes to raising your own children, whether you're leading a youth ministry or whatever you're doing, whether you're a teacher. And teachers know this better than anyone. And then parents know this too, but often they don't tie these two together. They don't really put the two and two together. In his way, more accurately translated, according to his way, changes everything about how we approach young people. It has to. That's what God is saying. That's what God has told Solomon here. It has to change it. So let me give you an example. Make a little bit of this crazy rambling of mine make sense today. When I was elected to be a trainer at my job, I had to sit through this e-learning video and read a pamphlet, a little section of a book about adult learners and the different styles of learning. And based on what's called the VARK, V-A-R-K model, there's 4 primary learning styles. The first one is visual. These are the people that love graphs, love charts, love pictures. PowerPoints are their friend. Then you've got the auditory learners. These are your conversationalists. These are the people who you can show them PowerPoints and graphs all day long and they're going to go to sleep. But if you talk to them, you speak with them, and have them reason through things verbally, they're going to get it. They're auditory learners. And then you've got the R in VARK, right? Reading. And it stands for reading and writing. So you're learners who prefer to just give me a textbook. Let me read it. Let me take my notes. and I'm good. Then I have it. And then you have the K, kinesthetic learners. These are your hands-on folks. These are your adults that I need to do it. I can read it, you can show me, I can watch, I can listen, I can study, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to learn a thing unless I actually do it, hands-on training style. I learned to ask people this up front. When I started training people in the healthcare field, started training people, I needed to know, what's your learning style? And now I ask this during interviews. What is your preferred learning style? It helps me, if I'm to lead and train you, to know how to best reach you. And if you ask that question, you're going to find that most adults have no problem identifying what kind of learning style they are. Oh, I'm a hands-on learner. Or just, give it to me in writing, let me read it, and then I'll get it. But if you're talking the entire time, I'm not going to, in one ear and out the other. That doesn't work for me. They know what kind of learning style that they are. Now, you can train your hardest, right? As a trainer, I can be doing my very best, explaining things and talking their ears off, thinking that they're an auditory learner. Really, they're a kinesthetic learner and they need to be hands-on, but I'm waiting until they seem like they understand it. Now, they're not learning the material, and I'm doing my hardest to train it. Does that make them a bad hire? Does that make them a bad employee because they aren't picking up the material? Of course not. It makes me a horrible trainer for not delivering it to them in a way that they can receive it. I'm not delivering the training according to their way. Now, we make this continual mistake in churches. Each week, thinking that preaching our traditions, our beliefs, our lessons, whatever we have, the same exact way is going to reach everyone. And that's not the case. And we think that by doing that, we're fulfilling our duty under Proverbs 22:6. We're training up a child in the way they should go, even though it has nothing to do with children, it has everything to do with young men. If they can get enlisted into war, that's what it's referring to. And then we commit this egregious error where we claim that if we did it right, they'll never depart from it. They'll never deviate off the path of what we have taught them. And anyone who's ever raised children knows that's not true. It's just not. If you've trained anyone at work or anything of that nature, you know that's just not true. Heaven forbid your child grows up, becomes an adult, and he leaves the church or leaves their faith entirely. What then? You obviously failed as a parent, right? If we're going to preach it this way, that means you failed, because we preach this as a promise. If you train up a child in the way they should go, they will not depart from it. We teach it as a promise of God. It's not. It's a warning. And we don't see it that way. Is if you train up a young man according to how he's going to receive it, how he's going to learn, then it sticks. Then he won't depart from it because it sticks. He learns it. That's what the Bible is saying in Proverbs 22:6. Now, we teach this as a promise. So if we fail to raise great young Christian men and women of God as parents, it sounds like we didn't uphold our end of the deal. Somehow we let our children down. Otherwise, they would still be in church. But that's not what this is saying. But there's a danger in thinking that's what it says. And that's how it's preached. Almost always. That's how it's preached. If you train them right, they will not leave the church. So they turn 18, get a mind of their own, decide to make their own decisions, and leave. Over 85% of them do. 85% of children raised in church when they're an adult leave. So either, if we're going to make this mistake of calling this a promise of God and misinterpreting this verse, and then using it as a weapon or a club to beat over the heads of parents that are already brokenhearted because they have a wayward child. And then we say, like, well, what'd you do wrong? If you would have trained them right, that wouldn't have happened. That is not the intent. It never was. So we use this verse as kind of one of those clubs that we beat over the heads of people to try to keep our traditions in tight hold, in a tight grip. We use this verse in an unauthentic way. And instead, we should understand this verse as it is actually written. Train a young man according to his way, and when he is old, he won't be removed from it. Right? It'll be a lot difficult to remove something from somebody if you taught it to them in a way they could learn it, in a way that clicked. And we all have examples of that. History was mine. I despised history all throughout elementary, middle school, high school. I hated history with a passion. I abhorred history. I couldn't learn it. It was just dates and random numbers, and I'm a numbers guy, but not when we're talking years, right? None of it worked. I could read it and get to the end of the chapter and go, I have no idea what I just read, and have to start over again until I got to 9th grade. And it was only 9th grade because I didn't have this teacher. I still remember Miss Robbins at my high school, 9th grade high school, studying history completely differently. There was no read the textbook. She taught like a college professor, but she taught in the oral tradition sense of history. She felt it was more effective. She was right. She was able to just sit up in the front of the class and just, let me tell you a story. And it was vivid and it was awesome. And I learned so much, the Aztecs and the Mayans, and this is great. I'm learning history for the first time in my life. It's clicking. Now, 34 years old, and it isn't removed from me because I remember that. She met me where I was at as an auditory learner. Very visual too when it comes to graphs. I like graphs and pictures. Comics are awesome. But she met me where I was at. If you meet people where they're at and give it to them in a way they can understand it and digest it, in a way that works for them according to their way, they're not going to depart from that. It won't be removed from them. God gave us each our own unique abilities and talents to leverage. We each learn differently. And I think we absolutely cannot be so set in our ways as church leaders, as parents, as friends, as teachers, as whatever. You can't be that absolutely set in your ways that you insist on teaching a one-size-fits-all method. So what happens to the kids that don't learn? We label them misfits. We label them outcasts, heathen, stupid, and we cast them out and cast them out of the church, kick them out of class. There's something wrong with them. They can't learn. I read a quote a long time ago, and it stuck with me. And it was this idea that if we judged everything, every animal by its ability to climb a tree, a fish would learn it, live its entire life believing it was stupid. Because that's not how a fish is supposed to operate. God made each of us, and God made each of you in the way that you're supposed to be. He doesn't make mistakes. So he made you to learn a certain way. He gave you different gifts to apply in a different environment and a different talent and a different way. Leverage those. Don't try to minimize those and fit into a mold somebody else has created for you. Learn to fit into the mold God has called you into. We need to train people where they're at, each according to their own way. We need to reach them where they're at. You know, I was thinking about this today too. Jesus is our example, is he not? How did Jesus train his disciples? Did he not use a boat in fishing to reach the fishermen? Right? Andrew, Peter, James, John. Did he not use miracles of healing to teach Luke the physician about who he was? Should we not also then try to train young men and young women in the way that they learn best? Now, I give you an example here. I have 3 daughters. My oldest, I knew from very early on, if she wanted to learn something, if I wanted to teach her something, I could literally give her a book. She would read the book. I'm good, I got it. Like, this is amazing. This is easy. Here you go, book, book, book. If I tried to do that with my second daughter, she would be doodling in the pages and coloring beautiful, beautiful drawings all throughout the book. But she wouldn't actually really pick up what's in the book because she's a very auditory conversationalist. She loves to talk and have conversations, and that's how she learns, in the discussions, in those moments. So I have to approach it completely differently if I went to teach something to my middle child. Now, my youngest child, if I were to hand her a book, and here's a book on financial management, she'd be ripping out the pages, folding up paper airplanes, flying them down the stairs, and then telling me all about the principles of aerodynamics that she learned from the book. Very kinesthetic, very hands-on learner. I can't approach a learning style with each of them exactly the same. Because then the only one who learns is the one that has the learning style that matches my teaching style. And this is what God is saying in Proverbs 22:6. Train up a young man according to his way. And when he's old, he won't depart from it. He won't stray off of that. It'd be accurate even to say that it wouldn't depart from him. Right? He'll learn it and it'll stick. Now, this idea that it's a promise, and if you haven't gotten this by now, you're not going to get it. It is not a promise of God. It is a warning of God, right? If you don't train up, a young man according to how he learns, right, he will depart from it. It'll depart from him. It's gone. That's what it's focusing on. It is not this promise that your children are going to, not develop a mind of their own. They're not going to make their own decisions. They're not going to make their own mistakes. Because I can guarantee you, I can promise you they will, just like you and I do. So it's not a promise that they're not going to go through hard times. They'll always be in church. That has nothing to do with it. If it is, then we have way too many examples in the American church of children who are wayward children who's kind of gone off and done their own thing. So then if that's the case, we know Proverbs 22, verse 6, as a promise, is a lie. And if it's a lie, then the whole Bible's suspect. If the whole Bible is questionable, then the whole thing falls apart. Do you see how dangerous it is when we start misinterpreting a verse? If it's a promise that your children are going to grow up to be great Christians, then these broken-hearted parents that are dealing with children going off doing their own thing, their own way, and doing it on their own, get beat up by the scripture versus instead being able to come into the church that they should be uplifted and be able to draw strength from becomes a source of pain. And that was never Christ's intention. He told Peter, right, I've prayed for you, that your faith fail not, right? Because Satan desires to sift you as wheat, is what he told him. He says, I've prayed that your faith fail not, but paraphrasing here, when it does, and then when you're converted, in other words, when you turn back to me, strengthen your brethren, right? We should be, as a church, a group of people able to encourage and uplift and edify one another, draw strength from one another. It shouldn't be a source of pain. We shouldn't go into church and feel like we got beat up more, torn down more. Now, there's a difference between going into a church, a preacher reading something out of the Bible, and you just being upset or feeling convicted and like, oh, I feel terrible and I don't want to go back there. Now, that's conviction, and you should probably work on that. You should probably listen to what God's trying to tell you and fix some things in your life. That's part of the process. I'm talking about going in and other believers saying things like, oh, your children went and did what? They're doing what now? They're out of church? What do you think you did wrong? Listen to me. If you're one of those parents and you have a child like that, I want you to hear me and hear me well. It is not necessarily your fault. I'm going to say that little asterisk there, necessarily. I mean, if you were a jerk to them, sure, okay. You're a jerk their entire childhood, that's probably on you, and that's between you and your therapist to work out. I'm talking about in general. It's probably not your fault. It probably just is. They have a mind of their own. They will make their own decisions. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's how we learn. It's how they learn, according to their way, even if it's not yours. But this is not a promise. It is not how it's been taught. I want you to understand that it's our job to train young people, to initiate them, to begin them on their path. Where they decide to go, how they decide to go about it, how they decide to get to where they're going, that's entirely up to them. Now, see, I've trained people at work, and I know they knew what they were doing, because I have to quiz them and grill them on it and drill them on every step. And yes, they know the procedures. They know the regulations. They know the laws. They are fully capable. I'm confident. And then a little bit of time goes by. They're signed off. They're off doing their own thing. And I've watched them go on to do great things. And I've watched some of those same people go on to do some pretty amazing, impressively stupid things. What went wrong? You knew it once. I know you knew it. I was there. What happened? Well, life happened. People do what people do. People make mistakes. People screw things up. That's fine. That's going to happen. We should expect people to make mistakes. We should expect that to happen. And if you're a parent, you should accept that when it happens as well. We probably shouldn't stress out over that. As parents, we probably shouldn't stress over the mistakes they make. That's how we learn, right? If you're going to launch a missile, this is one of my favorite examples, right? The Iron Dome in Israel, where it's a bunch of these little portable stations where they launch missiles, right? If an incoming rocket's coming in, they'll fire a missile at it and hit it in midair. You know how it does that? It sees where the missile's at here, and then it launches a missile, and as it's going, okay, well, now it's moved, right? The missile's moved. It needs to correct the path. Reprogram, and it's going here. And reprogram, it's going here. Reprogram, and recalculate until it finally hits its mark. It takes a step in one direction and then constantly has to correct. Corrections are how we learn. Now, I do want to dig into this idea also of where did God meet Moses? Because I was thinking about this, right? If as a parent, I feel like, I'm stressed out over what my kids are doing, the path my children are going, then I feel like on one hand, it's my job as a father to kind of stress out over that kind of stuff, make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do. But on the other hand, does that indicate a lack of trust in God? Does that indicate a lack of faith? So where did God meet Moses? I started thinking about that today. Where did God meet Moses? It was a burning bush in a field. He met him on a mountain. Met him in the wilderness. He didn't meet him in a temple. That's not where you see all the action. And then I was thinking also like Hagar. Where did God meet Hagar? And that's an important one in Genesis. Actually, get the verse, Genesis 16:7. And the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. Same word, in the way. He met Hagar beside a well. And he says something to her. Interesting passage. Read the entire thing. I highly recommend it. Study that passage. It's one of my favorites. But after they're done speaking, she responds with, read the NIV, for example, Genesis 16:13. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. She called him El Roy, the God who sees me. And it's the only time we ever see in the Bible where anyone names God, gives him a name to his face. And she chose El Roy, the God that sees me. So if God can see me in the wilderness, on a mountain, in a field, and meet me there where I'm at, if God can see you, and he sees you, he doesn't see you like you present yourself. He doesn't see you like you want to be seen. He sees you, the you that you're afraid to see yourself sometimes. He sees who you are, who you truly are. If he can see that, then why am I worried if my children make mistakes along their way? After all, that's how they learn. If God's taking care of me, he'll take care of them. That I have to have faith and trust in. It's my job to train them. It's my job to train up the young men, the young women. But I want to go, there's a lot of clarity I want to give you here. And I hope you get it from this verse the way I did. Go to Proverbs 16:9. Proverbs 16:9 says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. So the heart of man plans his own way. I think King James renders it, the heart of a man devises his way, but the Lord orders his steps. If that means we're going to make our own plans according to our way, that's going to happen, right? The heart is also, it also says in the Bible that the heart is, deceitfully wicked. Who can know it? If that's the case and that's what's planning our way, are we doomed from the start? No, because it says that the Lord establishes his steps. Helps him to correct path. Helps to teach him. So, Proverbs 22:6 isn't parenting advice after all. Okay? So, yeah, not in the conventional sense, not like raising children. It's more to do with young adults. Specifically, I want to highlight a point here that this verse does refer to young men. And not in the way of like mankind and, where like Adam and Eve, everybody's a man and it's referring to like human. It's not saying that. It's specifically referring to the gender. Male. Young men. Young men of valor. Young men. There's a ton of other verses. As a father of daughters, I know for a fact there's a ton of other verses when it comes to guidance on how to raise young ladies, young women. But this one's talking about men. How to raise young men, how to train young men. And I don't think that can be understated. We need to not miss that point. So in other words, this, as a dad, what I'm learning from this verse is that our jobs don't end when the kids turn 18, right? They're off on their own. My job is done. They've survived. They're out into the world. It doesn't end there, but it shifts. It shifts from raising to training. Now, we no longer have to focus at that point, at that age, on raising our boys to know that biting their sister's bad. They should know that by that point. If you're raising them and then they turn 18, you shouldn't have to keep raising them with the same skills, the same rules, right? You should be able to grow past that. So if I'm raising young boys and they're 18, 19, 20, it's no longer a focus on, don't bite your sister. That's not good. It shifts. And now I'm training this young man that don't fight with your spouse. Learn how to resolve conflict. If I'm training a young man, I no longer have to focus on teaching them that cheating on a math test is bad. Instead, it shifts to training them that, cheating on your wife is not good. That is going to rob you of all the blessings of a faithful marriage and a faithful relationship. And every day is a battle. It shouldn't be a battle in your relationship. When you go out into the world every day and everything you're doing is a constant battle, it's constant struggle, and every man knows this. We have a great way of everything's calm on the outside. But every man I know is going through it. We're going through a lot. And there's struggles every day. And there's battles and demons that every man's fighting. And it's in that war that you're going to fight, that daily battle. Your wife needs to be your ally. And in fact, she's going to be the greatest ally you'll ever have. Protect your ally. And then that relationship will serve you well. If you sabotage your allies in a war, right? You got to protect the allies at all costs because they're who have your back. If you sabotage that early on, you're left to fight the battle alone, and it's going to be a much harder battle to win. If I'm training young men instead of raising boys, I no longer have to focus on worrying about raising them to follow our traditions in order for them to feel closer to God the way that I do following such traditions. It shifts towards encouraging them to pursue the calling that God has put on their life in the way God wants them to pursue it, so that they can build that relationship with Him and have that closeness with God that I do. Just because it's different than what I do does not mean it's wrong. It's just different. In the same way, my talents, my abilities, and my learning skills, my learning styles are going to be different. That doesn't mean one's wrong, one's not. As long as they are honestly stepping forward and trying to step into the calling and the purpose that God has created them for, then I feel like I have done my job. I've done it well. Now, if I'm raising young men, training young men, I should say, I no longer have to worry about raising and instilling basic life skills, right? By the time they're like 8, hopefully before they're a teenager, they have certain things just down, right? I shouldn't have to look at a 19 or 20-year-old young man, and tell him, like, you're filthy and covered in dirt, you need to go take a bath, man. Instead, it shifts. And this shift goes from basic life skills like that to training young men to know that no matter what kind of dirt you get yourself into, Christ can wash it all clean. It shifts. We should no longer have to teach them to walk it off every time they fall and scrape a knee. Instead, my role as a father shifts towards training them to take a knee when they fall in their walk. I should no longer have to worry about raising boys to be boys. We should instead worry about training boys to be men. Men of integrity, men of character, men of honor, men of action, and men of faith. And then when they get a little bit older and they get married and they start putting all of these life lessons that you've been training into them into practice, then, Dad, it gets to shift again. Now your role shifts towards training these men how to raise boys. We need fathers in the homes. Just like moms are important and never get a break, and there's no rest for moms, the same applies to fathers. There's no rest for dads either. The job's never done. It's a lifelong commitment, and it's a lifelong calling of God that we are called to step into courageously and boldly, to step forward without fear, and to raise our boys and train them up as men. but it's worth it. Being a father, I could say, is exceedingly worth it. Best thing I ever did. Love my kids. Wouldn't change a thing. Now, I will leave you with this. Psalms 127, verses 1 through 5. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman walketh but in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. Lo, children are a heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. Let's raise up our quivers and then train them to hit their mark, men. Get your shift together. See y'all next week. Love you.